In 1169, the successful Kurdish Sunni Muslim general Saladin was fighting for the Shia Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt and ended up being appointed as vizier. By 1171, he overthrew the Shia Caliphate from the inside and realigned the country of Egypt with the Sunni Muslim Caliphate based in Baghdad. In 1174, he entered into Syria, being welcomed into Damascus, and by 1182, despite numerous assassination attempts, he had united the Egyptian and Syrian empires. This left the Crusader states surrounded by a united Muslim power, and they were crushed at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, with Jerusalem falling shortly afterwards, 88 years after it had been retaken by the Christians in the First Crusade. The fall of Jerusalem sent ripples throughout Western Europe, much more so than with the First and the Second Crusade. Religious zeal came to the fore. Pope Urban III even collapsed and died when he heard about the defeat at the Battle of Hattin. His successor in 1187 would frame the fall of Jerusalem as punishment for the sins of Europe's Christians and called for a new crusade. King Henry II of England, of Thomas Becket fame, and Philip Augustus II of France called for a ceasefire in their long-standing war and together announced a joint crusade. Though the death of Henry in 1089 meant that Richard I, the Lionheart, who would take over the English contingent, would lead those forces. And I don't think it can be understated how significant and radical it was for England and France to come to peace and seek a joint crusade. Even if, in the end, secular matters of marriage and prestige would lead to the strong bond between Richard and Philip disintegrating. Richard and Philip would head to the Holy Land by sea, stopping over in Sicily. Meanwhile, though, in Germany, the old Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa assembled an immense force, crusading being nothing new to him, given that he had fought in the Second Crusade in the late 1140s. But now he was emperor, and much older, at 67 years of age. He was also wiser, and he prevented the massacring of Jews in his lands, as had happened in previous crusades, by having them pay a small tax towards the crusade, and in return placing them all under imperial protection. This is in stark contrast, sadly, to events in England, the first time England had really joined in these crusades on this scale. In England there were many massacres of the Jews, including those who fled to Clifford's Tower in York, only to have it surrounded and besieged by a crusading mob, and the Jews taking their own lives rather than be forced to convert to Christianity or die at the end of a crusading mob. Frederick's crusade moved not by sea but across land, gaining many more forces in the Kingdom of Hungary before arriving in the Byzantine Empire, where issues began, due to issues over the Byzantine Emperor refusing to recognise Frederick by his imperial title as Holy Roman Emperor. You may remember that the Byzantine Empire is the Roman Empire, so there can only be one Roman emperor. This led to battles and burning and pillaging before finally the Crusaders crossed over to Anatolia. There have been historic allegations that the Byzantine Emperor had actually allied himself with Saladin. And while he certainly was a dismal ruler on every count, this is unlikely to be true, and modern historians have now largely concluded that he wasn't allied to Saladin. He was just dealing with his own issues in a way which didn't enarmour him to the Western Crusaders. Now in Turkey, the German contingent of the Third Crusade under Frederick Barbarossa ran into, shall we say, issues and tragedy. Frederick had been promised safe passage by the Turks, but instead they harassed his armies constantly. He defeated them decisively in battle twice, even taking their capital city of Iconium in 1190. All was going well, but then on the 10th of June 1190, the emperor's horse slipped on the rocks while crossing a river, and Frederick, 67 years old, in his armour, fell in and he drowned. At this point, most of the German crusade returned to the empire because of the chaos that an ensuing election of a new emperor would undoubtedly bring. But his son led an army of 5,000 on to Antioch, where eventually they would travel south and meet up with Richard and Philip, at this point still procrastinating over in Sicily. Richard and Philip fell out in Sicily after Richard broke his promise to marry Philip's half-sister, and therefore on the way over Philip went first. Richard did follow, but due to a storm at sea, he was struck, and his sister and a lot of treasure was captured by the rebel Byzantine leader of Cyprus. This ultimately led to Richard conquering the island of Cyprus from the rebel Byzantine leader, only to sell it to the Knights Templar in its entirety a year later. Acre, a key city on the coast under Saladin's control, was being besieged at this time by the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And the Kingdom of Jerusalem, although it didn't have the city of Jerusalem, was joined by the remnants of Frederick's crusade and later by Philip's soldiers finally arriving from Sicily. But all three of these forces together achieved little, apart from being surrounded themselves by forces belonging to Saladin, although he was not there, and suffering from an immense amount of disease. Richard the Lionheart arrived in 1191, and he took charge of the situation. The city, which had been under siege at this point for nearly 2 whole years, fell to Richard and his forces in just over a month. The resulting disputes, though, over the spoils of war and who would be the King of Jerusalem once again, not that Jerusalem was in Christian control at this time, led to Philip and the Germans leaving the Holy Land. But Richard stayed, and Saladin really wished that he hadn't. Richard would crush devastatingly Saladin's army at the Battle of Arsuf, leading them humiliated and shamed in the eyes of the Islamic caliphates. For the first time, Saladin was revealed to not be invincible. Richard then continued to conquer the city of Jaffa and thus secured the entire coast for the Crusader kingdoms. Saladin tried to retake Jaffa, but he was again defeated and he sued for peace. Jerusalem would not be returned to the Crusaders, but pilgrims and traders would be guaranteed protection there. Neither side was happy with this peace agreement. The Christian West was distraught that Jerusalem had not been captured, and the Muslim states were equally distressed that they had been defeated and humiliated. Key, though, was this increasing sense of the Christian West versus the Muslim East, with the Byzantine Empire stuck somewhere in between, not Muslim, but not Catholic allied to the Pope, caught between the two and a thorn in the side of them both. Which leads us nicely to the tragedy of the Fourth Crusade. The Third Crusade had been a real success by securing the Crusader kingdoms along the coast and putting Cyprus in the hands of the West to allow safe resupply of the kingdoms. But it didn't capture Jerusalem. And so the Fourth Crusade was called by the new Pope in 1198. But Germany was now in an intense struggle with the Pope over the usual power struggles of church and state and who was really in charge, and England and France were again deeply embroiled in their endless war. Nonetheless, an army was raised in northeastern France and decided to target Egypt, the powerhouse of the Muslim state, which, following the death of Saladin, a few years of civil war, had again been reunited. Attacking Egypt, though, would mean needing a proper fleet of ships, and so Venice, a growing and ambitious Italian city-state, stepped in. But when the time came and the crusading force arrived in Venice, much smaller than expected, they couldn't pay the agreed amount for all of the ships that had been built. And so a deal was struck that the Crusaders would attack and capture the Christian, Catholic city of Zara in modern-day Croatia, which had recently rebelled against Venice. The sacking of Zara led to the Pope excommunicating the entire crusade. But the leaders of the crusade simply didn't tell their soldiers that fact. Meanwhile, and here it gets a bit complicated, the brother of the recently overthrown previous Byzantine emperor met with the Crusaders, and he offered to give his army to the crusade to pay the debt to the Venetians entirely and place the entire Eastern Orthodox Church under the Pope's authority if they helped him retake Constantinople for his family. This was clearly a ridiculous and impossible offer he had no power to really do. But the Venetians hated the Byzantines, and for the leader of Venice it was personal, and they persuaded the Crusaders to accept this deal. Constantinople, arguably the most important city in Christendom, 500,000 people inside, a centre of trade and culture and learning, the city which held back the Muslim kingdoms from advancing westward, was captured by the Crusaders in 1203. 100,000 were left homeless. Huge parts of the city were destroyed in fire and rioting. Constant conflict and strife ensued between the newly appointed Byzantine emperor and those still in the city who were loyal to the previous one, and the Crusaders. And in 1204, a year later, the city was sacked by the crusading forces for 3 days. The letters from the Pope telling them not to attack the city were again ignored by the leadership and kept from the common crusading soldiers. For 3 days, the Latin crusaders murdered, pillaged, raped, looted and destroyed on a scale almost never seen before. They sacked and burned churches, they raped nuns, they killed monks. The sacking of Constantinople led to the creation of the Latin Empire of Constantinople, with the remaining Byzantine lands splitting into smaller empires, the most significant being the Empire of Nicaea, which you may remember was recaptured during the First Crusade, which was based in northwest of modern-day Turkey. Any hope of reuniting the Eastern and Western Church was in absolute tatters. The historian Sir Stephen Runciman said this about the Fourth Crusade: "There was never a greater crime against humanity than the Fourth Crusade." He may have been stretching it a bit, but he wasn't far off. The Byzantines would retake Constantinople 54 years later, but the empire was a broken thing and would inevitably fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Arguably, that farce should have been the end of the Crusades, but it wasn't, and the Pope called for another one. The Fourth Crusade was to be mainly filled, the Fifth Crusade was mainly filled with Hungarians and Austrians, and it arrived in Antioch, thankfully it did make it to the Holy Land, in 1217, where it engaged in some inconclusive battles. It would later join up with the King of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which still didn't actually hold the city, and the orders of the Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and the Knights of the Teutonic Order. Together they would move on Egypt, the source of the Sultanate's power. And the Crusaders successfully did take the key port of Damietta in 1219. And the Sultan of Egypt, embroiled in his own civil wars, sued for peace, including offering Jerusalem to the Crusaders, the thing they were really after. It was an offer they really should have accepted. But the papal legate, the leader of the crusade, would not negotiate. In 1221, instead, the Crusaders, filled with knights from the Holy Land and people from Europe, marched on Cairo and were soundly defeated, having accomplished nothing. In 1227, the Sixth Crusade, the Crusade of Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, was launched. Frederick had promised to join the Fifth Crusade, but he never did, and his failure to keep that vow haunted him. And eventually, with the Muslim Caliphate in a state of civil war, he took his opportunity, his forces being bolstered by a significant English contingent. Now, this is beyond the scope of this lecture, but despite being excommunicated by the Pope for other secular reasons involving Sicily and southern Italy, Frederick and his crusaders arrived at Acre. Unlike the previous crusade, led by a papal legate, this crusade was led by Frederick, who spoke Arabic, who had an admiration for Muslim society, and a deep dislike for Rome, who had excommunicated him. The Crusader army, at this point actually a shadow of its former self due to desertions, never actually fought the Muslims. Instead, a deal was signed along the lines of that offered during the Fifth Crusade. Jerusalem and much of the surrounding land, including Bethlehem, Nazareth and Jaffa, were given back to the Crusader kingdoms, with the exception of the Temple Mount and the Dome on the Rock and a few key mosques in Jerusalem, which would remain under Muslim control. A 10-year truce was also agreed between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Muslims based around Egypt. The Sixth Crusade, therefore, involved no fighting and was not supported by the Pope, who had excommunicated Frederick. And this demonstrates the erosion of papal authority and the changing nature of the conflict between the Muslims and Christians. Clearly at this point, again, it was not such a religious conflict. It was instead much more political. People were caring about their own kingdoms rather than the kingdom of their religion. But such peace would not last. At the end of a 10-year truce, the so-called Barons' Crusade was launched, which actually captured more land than Frederick had gained by diplomacy. Again, though, there were no major battles. Instead, the various crusaders used diplomacy to play different Muslim factions off against each other to secure more and more land. But much of this would come to nothing when new forces from northern Syria called, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, the Khwarezmians, something along those lines. They would come over and they controlled a lot of the area around modern-day Iran and Iraq, and they came down from northern Syria and they sacked and they reduced Jerusalem to rubble. in 1244, massacring all the Christians they found and going on to crush much of the Crusader state's power, and they won a number of major military battles. The Crusader states were almost, but not entirely, wiped off the map. The destruction of Jerusalem led to Louis IX of France launching the Seventh Crusade in 1248, which attacked Egypt and led to his capture by the Muslims and the death of almost all of his soldiers. He was eventually released in 1254 and launched the Eighth Crusade against Tunis in 1270, which likewise ended in disaster, with Louis and most of his crusaders dying of disease not long after landing in Tunisia. The final crusade to the Holy Land was the Ninth, in 1271 to 1272, also known as Lord Edward's Crusade, and sometimes considered an extension or a part of the Eighth Crusade. At this point, the willingness and energy to crusade against the Muslims was all but spent. And though Edward and his 1,000 crusaders, really not that many in comparison to previous crusades, did actually make it to the Holy Land, they achieved very little, despite forming an alliance with the Mongols to try and take on the Mamluks, who were now dominating northern Africa, Egypt, and the Holy Land. He would leave in 1272 to become King of England and deal with political matters back home. The Mamluks, though, in the ascendancy, continued their advances against a few remaining Crusader kingdom cities and holdings. They had a policy of utterly destroying all evidence of the Western Crusaders whenever they captured their settlements. In 1291, the final Crusader holdings in the Holy Land fell to the Mamluks, and 197 years after the Latin Christian control started at the end of the First Crusade, the few remaining survivors fled to Cyprus. And so ends our three-part series on the Holy Land Crusades, their successes, their failures, their changing nature, the shifting emphasis and power, the role of division and disunity in both Christendom and the Islamic caliphates, the gross hypocrisy and crimes against humanity on all sides, against all sides, including their own sides, which these crusades involved. Next session, we will look at two other spheres of crusading which overlap this period: the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula and the Northern Crusades against the pagans of the Baltic region and the Eastern Orthodox Republic of Novgorod, because crusades wouldn't be complete, obviously, without crusading against other Christians. But we'll leave that for next time.